Hello and welcome everyone to ICAST 2020 Online Conservation Seminar Series. My name is Mike Wayne. I'm ASA's Atlantic Fisheries Policy Director, and I'm joined today by Krista Bank, who is the Fisheries Liaison for Vineyard Wind. And we are here to talk about the coexistence of fisheries and offshore wind energy. Krista, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for allowing me to be here and share my information with everybody today. So I appreciate the opportunity.
For sure. Before we get started, I wanted to just introduce this topic a little more broadly, as ASA last year developed a position statement on offshore wind energy development because I'm showing this map here of the Atlantic coast, and you can see there's a lot of lease areas that are currently held by developers from Massachusetts up here off Cape Cod all the way down to North Carolina. And so offshore wind development is a really complicated process. Chris and I had several conversations as ASA was putting together their position statement, and each one of these lease areas is at a different stage in the offshore wind development process. And so I wanted to put this seminar together to give some more details on what these wind energy projects actually look like, what do the structures look like, what is the transmission cables, and Vineyard Wind, which is this lease area up off of Cape Cod, is actually the farthest along in this wind energy development process. So we thought they were a good candidate to have this discussion, and they've been really helpful as we've engaged on this topic. So Krista is gonna walk through our position statement on offshore wind and talk about Vineyard Wind's project that's up off of Cape Cod. So Krista, let me turn it over to you, and you'll have control from here.
Okay, so I'm going to click show my screen, and I am going to go to that screen.
Yep.
Can everybody see my screen and my cursor moving?
Yep.
Okay, so now I will move this down, click here. Okay, so again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share information. And my role as a fisheries liaison is to improve the communication between the fishing industry and the wind developers. And so I'm going to talk today about ways that we are working towards improving that communication and finding ways that offshore wind and fisheries can coexist. So thank you again for listening. And I've organized the talk today based on your position statement, and I have it organized on the different topics that you've listed, starting with construction operations, and then I'll go into access, monitoring, and mitigation. And please stop me at any time to ask questions, Mike. So what you're looking at here is what's called the Massachusetts Rhode Island Wind Energy Area. This is about a 1,400 square mile area that's slated for offshore wind. I've also added onto this chart some of the management closures that the fishing industry deals with. This is a habitat management area closure. This is the scallop management rotational closure here. And what we're looking at within the wind energy area, each dot represents a turbine location. And what you're seeing is this grid pattern. And really the purpose behind this continuous grid pattern was because all the developers want to ensure that fishing, all different types of fishing, recreational, mobile, commercial gear, static fixed gear, can still fish in and around the wind turbines. And of course, we want fishing to continue, and we want transit and navigation to continue safely. So when I first started 2 years ago, there was not a uniform pattern of wind turbine layouts. Even the Vineyard Wind layout was at a northwest-southeast angle. The spacing wasn't uniform, but it quickly became apparent from the fishing industry that that would cause a lot of chaos. So the developers worked together to come up with this uniform layout. And so it's a 1 by 1 nautical mile spacing. So you can transit north-south and east-west with 1 nautical mile spacing between the turbines. With the uniform layout, there's also, you can transit diagonally through the wind energy area with a 0.7 nautical mile spacing. And this has still prompted some concern that transit corridors are still necessary. And recently the Coast Guard has produced a report. It's called MARIPARS, which stands for the Mass Rhode Island Ports Access Route Study, to look to see to make sure that safe navigation can continue in this area and to see if additional transit corridors are necessary. The conclusion from that report was that additional transit corridors will not be necessary as long as the developers adhere to a uniform layout throughout this entire wind energy area. And again, it's 1 by 1 nautical miles, north-south, east-west, and 0.7 at the diagonal. So this is a proposal that's on the table. We're in the middle of the permitting process for this first project. This is the Vineyard Wind 1 project. This is an 800 megawatt project that was accepted with Massachusetts. We just recently were awarded another 800 megawatt project with Connecticut, and that will take place, or the electricity will be generated in the southern portion of this lease area. Vineyard Wind also has this easternmost lease area. They each have different numbers, but this is the easternmost lease area. Right now, that's not slated for development yet. So with each 800 megawatt project, in order to get the electricity to shore, you need an offshore export cable corridor. And this blue shaded area here is the cable corridor, which has been surveyed to figure out where the best place is to install the cables. The goal is to make sure that you're avoiding any complex habitat, any eelgrass beds, any sensitive habitat. You survey a much wider area than is actually needed for the installation. You only need about a 3.5 foot wide trench for the cable, for each cable. And the cables for an 800 megawatt project, you actually need 2 cables because the maximum capacity of the offshore export cable is 400 megawatts. So for the first Massachusetts project, there'll be 2 cables running up through this corridor. And for the Connecticut project, there'll be an additional 2 that we want to keep in this corridor here. The other big goal for the offshore export cable is to make sure that it's buried deep enough so that any electronic magnetic fields are either 0 or reduced dramatically. So for the type of cable we're using, the modeling says if we get it buried between 5 to 8 feet, there will be a negligible amount of electronic magnetic fields. So the goal is to get it buried deeply, one, so you can fish over it and in and around it, and also to reduce those electronic magnetic fields. So I'll stop here for Mike if you have any questions at this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Krista. So looking at this map, the corridor cable runs between Nantucket and the Vineyard, and I know that there's a lot of current that runs between the islands there. You know, I've fished those rips, really important fishery for striped bass and bluefish and other species. And so I'm just wondering, do you guys have information on that? And are you incorporating how much current runs through there and how often the sediment moves through that area when you went through your planning phase for these cable runs?
Yes, yeah, especially there's been extensive surveying around this area because it is such a dynamic area. We've had 2 years of surveys in here, and we're still doing some more collecting survey data here this summer as well. yeah, there is a lot of shifting sand in there and sand waves. You can even see the difference between the couple of years data we've collected. And so again, going back to that 5 to 8 feet, you want to get that cable buried. We don't count that shifting sand and the mobile sand. You start at the stable sediment and then start that 5 to 8 foot depth that you're targeting. So yes, there is a lot of current through there, and with the survey data we have, then we're confident that we can get the cable. I mean, it's better for the developer to make sure that cable is buried. Obviously, again, for the EMF and fishing reasons, but also to protect the cable. So it's in everybody's best interest to make sure that that cable is buried as deep as possible. And if for some reason it can't be buried, there are some type of cable protections that you can put over it. But that will be decided as things go along. The goal is to make sure that it's buried.
And the issues are mainly for hard substrates, right? Which we don't see through there. It's real sandy bottom. So
right. And it's just, since it's such a dynamic area, is making sure that you're getting again in that stable sediment, because those sand waves will keep shifting and moving. And yeah, I've heard stories from fishermen about all types of things that when they fish there, things that weren't there one day, they come back a few weeks later and you've got you've got something there you didn't have to contend with before. So yeah, so the goal is to get it buried and to get as much data from that area to make sure we can do it.
Okay, great, thanks.
Sure. And this is just an image of what that offshore export cable looks like. Since it's a 400 megawatt, it's large. It's about 11 to 12 inches in diameter. And this shows just a schematic view of an offshore wind farm. So here's that offshore export cable going to the onshore transmission station. It comes from this electric service platform. And then between each turbine, you'll have an inter-array cable. That will be a smaller cable, both in size and in voltage, between each turbine that will connect to the electric service platform. And this is an image of a installation vessel here. So that's just a schematic of how it works. And this shows you the dimensions of a 9.5 megawatt turbine. And for the sake of permitting, since turbines are getting bigger and the technology is changing, when you start your permitting process, you want to have a range of turbines that you will eventually contract with to install. So for example, the range of the size of a wind turbine generator that the Vineyard Wind project is permitting for can be as small as 8 megawatts or up to 14 megawatts. So we actually still haven't decided yet on which turbine we're going to contract with, but 9.5 has a good potential. And this is the diameter that you see here, or the size of the blade spinning. The diameter here is just shy of 600 feet. And then this is called the hub height to the surface of the water. That is just shy of 400 feet. So they're very large, and they will start to get larger than that as well. And then this shows what the type of foundation we'll be using on this project is a monopile. So it's basically one monopile going into the substrate. You might be familiar with the Block Island one. That's on a jacket foundation. And after the monopile goes into the sediment, this piece is called the transition piece. And then you have the wind turbine generator on top of it. And then the monopile can penetrate the substrate up to about 150 feet. So it goes into the sediment pretty deeply. And then what's also a very important component is the scour protection. So this is about 30 feet across, and then you'll need about 80 feet of scour protection on either side of the turbine. It will be 360 feet around the turbine, but you're taking up a footprint of about 160 feet. So the advantage to a monopile, especially in the sediment type in the Vineyard Wind 1 lease area, it's not rocky at all. It's pretty soft sediment. The advantage is the footprint or the disturbance to the ocean floor is minimal. The installation is actually pretty fast. You can do a couple of monopiles within a day. And that reduces, of course, any pile driving that's necessary for installation. And another big part of the installation process here will include protection for marine mammals. So you'll have protected species observers on board, and they'll be using both visual, looking for the marine mammals, and passive acoustic monitoring. And if there's any sighting of marine mammals within a certain range from the pile driving site, all operations will stop. So this is what will be happening with the foundation and installation.
So Chris, a question before you move on about the scour protection area.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you mentioned that the scour material will likely be rocks. I was just wondering what process you guys went through, and did you consider other material for scour protection? And I'm assuming that scour protection is around the entire monopile foundation.
Yes, yeah. So the scour protection is rocks. It's going to be natural rocks, different sizes. And the scour protection that's used, it's part of the engineering process, and so it has to be like a certain depth and a certain distance away from the monopile, just to for the technical integrity of the structure. So it's really, the scour protection is really important. It has been suggested from the recreational community to create more structure around the base as scour protection. However, in the regulatory process, the regulators, both state and federal, want to see as little disturbance or as little change as possible for these projects, and adding more structures into the water is not something they want to see at this stage. Now, that doesn't mean as we go along that can't be something that's incorporated or added, but for this first project, it was clear from the regulatory process that you want to do as little, change the habitat as little as possible. So it will be 360 degrees around. It will be rocks of, sort of small to middle size. And I forget the depth that it needs to be at, but all of that is part of the engineering and the technical process to make sure that the integrity of the monopile is secure. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of our community is interested in the habitat that's going to be created by that scour protection area, so that's why I asked the question.
Right. Yeah. And then the next image is just an image of the electric service platform. So for the first 800 megawatt project, there'll be one electric service platform where those inter-array cables will feed into this, and then the offshore export cable will come to shore. And then this image shows a construction installation vessel. This is called the jack-up barge. And this leads into one of your other priorities of trying to make sure construction doesn't impact the height of the season for the recreational fishery. However, summertime is the best weather in the North Atlantic, and there are limitations to these installation vessels of when they can operate safely. So they actually can only operate in certain wave heights, and even the cable it can't drop below a certain temperature. So there's certain weather and temperature restrictions on some of the installation that needs to be done for this project. But what can happen is the installation, the whole area will not be off limits during the installation process. So there will be a finite area as to where construction is happening, and then fishing can happen in and around that area. And as I mentioned before, with monopiles, the installation process is pretty quick. So that sort of off limits construction area will be constantly moving. And that's where making sure the outreach to the fishing industry is happening on basically a daily basis, because the construction zone will be constantly shifting and moving. And something else to consider, if there are, fishing derbies or tournaments in the area that are happening that might be on the edge of where some construction activity would be taking place, reaching out to those organizers to see if we could maybe have some construction happen away from any derbies or tournaments during certain times of year. That's something that's doable, because again, the whole area will not be off limits during construction. which leads into another one of your priorities, which is access. And it is in the developer's best interest to make sure that access is not limited at all to the fishing industry. The whole reasoning for the 1-by-1 layout, for burying the cables, is to make sure that access can continue uninhibited in the wind energy areas. So during construction, again, there will be some safety zones that will be worked out with the Coast Guard of what they're comfortable with the safety zone, but access will not be limited. There's no, it would not be in the developer's best interest to limit access. Do you have any questions, Mike?
So Krista, yeah, we talked about this quite a bit, and perhaps we can follow up and work more on it. But one of the things you see we call for is development of an access plan, because we've heard from a lot of developers just what you have said, which is there's no intent to limit access and you want to actually promote it. But it would be great to formalize that with some sort of documentation. And so I think as a follow-up, that's something that we can work on. I know that you guys likely do not have the authority to restrict access within your lease area, but it would be great to see the developer supporting our position on maintaining access to these areas. Yes,
yeah, you are correct. The developers do not have the authority to restrict the area at all. It would be BOEM or the Coast Guard, and they have had no indications of wanting to restrict access at all, but neither agency has. So again, this is, as my role as fishery liaison, I can talk to the developers about some type of formal agreement about it, but I think up till now it hasn't been a big issue because we don't have the authority and we haven't heard any indication that BOEM or the Coast Guard would ever want to do that. But I see, I can understand where something more formal would be appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, there's just some concern that there might be some event where that sentiment changes, in which everyone's in agreement that there's no intent to limit access. But if there's a way that we can try to unify with the developers on this, that's what we're looking for.
On to monitoring, and your priorities here for monitoring are pretty universal. Is making sure that the data can be used by agencies, making sure that there's inclusion of stakeholders and state and federal agencies on the monitoring plans, and that the existing survey data can be used. So this has been something that I think we have done a pretty good job at achieving. There is a lot of survey activity that happens in the lease area. There's a lot of geophysical and geotechnical surveys that happen, both to collect data for the permitting process and for the engineering process. Then there's a lot of, obviously, biological data collected. So for the avian surveys that happen in the lease area, we actually use a recreational fishing vessel, the Helen H. out of Hyannis, to conduct those surveys. There's some marine mammals and sea turtle surveys that we do in conjunction with the New England Aquarium, that are the overflight vessels. And then the fishery surveys, the pre-construction, during, and post-construction monitoring surveys, those we got some guidelines from BOEM, but didn't really have a detailed enough approach for fisheries. So what Vineyard Wind was, they reached out to SMAST, which is the School for Marine Science and Technology in New Bedford. They have a good working relationship with commercial fishing industry and recreational fishing industry for collaborative research. And we wanted to ask them what their recommendations would be for monitoring plans that incorporate the concerns of the fishing industry and state and federal regulators. So there are quite a few meetings, 4 with fishermen, 1 on the Cape, 1 on the Vineyard, 1 in New Bedford, and 1 in Point Judith, to get input from the fishing industry, what their concerns were and what species they wanted studied. And then there are follow-up meetings with state and federal regulators about what should go into these monitoring plans. And it was pretty universal, again, in conjunction with your priorities, that all of the surveys should be comparable to other surveys that are existing surveys that are out there. The data should be comparable and could be adopted by other developers so that you have a larger data set of fisheries information. So what came from those recommendations were a few different survey approaches. The first one is a ventless trap survey that also we combine it with plankton tows. And the survey design for this basically follows the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Council survey designs. So you have vented and ventless traps. It's also is comparable to the Rhode Island and state lobster survey designs as well. During this survey, we also document Jonah crab presence, and we had some black sea bass pots there as well. So again, this survey can be compared to the survey designs that were described through ASMFC, and the state uses it as well. Then for the drop camera, this is this pyramid you see here. It use a scallop vessel to deploy the equipment, and you take video and still images of the habitat, the benthic habitat, and you're looking at abundance and distribution of benthic megafauna. This survey design has been used for scallops. It's used for stock assessment. So again, there's a large data set to compare it with. And then the other large survey, and this trawl survey is actually done 4 times a year. You're looking at the distribution and abundance of different finfish species. But the survey design follows the same survey design as the NEMAP survey, which is an inshore survey. It stands for the Northeast Area Monitoring Program. It's done on commercial vessels, and this is a survey that's happened for over, I think, just about 10 years. It's done all along the East Coast, and the Science Center has used data from that survey, and it now again has a long time series that it can be comparable to. So these ones started in 2019, and then the other survey or the study that's happened is really focusing on highly migratory species, which is a big interest to the recreational community. And there's 2 parts to this study. One, it was looking at different data sources to look for presence absence of highly migratory species, not just in the Vineyard Wind Lease area, but in that whole Mass Rhode Island wind energy area. So it took different data sources. One was from the NOAA Large Pelagic Survey data, and they looked at conventional tagging data from multiple different organizations, compiled it together, and looked at a time series of data of different species in that whole entire area. And then the second component to that study had an online survey geared at recreational fishermen to show, it was only about 4 questions. It could be done really quickly. It was advertised through On the Water magazine and other online social media places. And there are basically 4 questions. Where, both in and outside the lease area, do you fish? About how many times a year do you fish there? What species do you target? And what type of fishing do you do? Is it trolling? Is it drift fishing? So there are 4 kind of basic questions. And all that data was compiled into a final report, which is actually up on our website right now. If you go to the Vineyard Wind website, and you look under, there's a tab for fishermen, and you look under fisheries surveys. The data from this highly migratory species report is up there, as well as the 2019 data from the 3 previous surveys I mentioned. So all of that data is publicly available and is on our website. And
so Krista, sorry, before you move on, just a few clarifying questions. The survey data you talked about, you would categorize that as pre-construction or baseline data that's being collected in the area, meaning you guys have not moved forward with construction yet, but you're collecting information through those surveys that will allow you to analyze what it looked like before construction with what it will look like after construction. And that's the idea here, correct?
Correct, yes, yeah. And the goal is to get a couple of years of data done before any construction or any changes happen. And then the design of the studies is to look at the impact area, which is where the wind turbines are going to go, and compare them to a control area, which is outside of the lease area, and see if there's any changes between the control area and the impact area throughout time.
Okay.
So the real important part is to making sure the science starts before any construction happens. And so we'll have at least 2 years, close to 3 years of data before construction happens. Any other questions?
I think we're ready to move on. Thanks.
And we have another study that's happening. There's been a lot of concern that the wind turbines are going to impact different radar units. They're going to obscure being able to see other vessels in the area. So in this fall, we are going to, we're working with Baird Consultant, who is a navigation and safety specialist. They designed some different scenarios that we're going to take 2 different size fishing vessels with older radar units, comparing them to newer radar units to see if the newer radar units won't have the same problem as the old ones, where there's some issues where there's, forgive me if I had the wrong terminology, but if there's ghosting or false echoes in there, we're trying to see if the newer radar units will eliminate those problems. So there'll be a few different scenarios for one larger vessel going in between the turbine, this vessel going that way. And on each fishing vessel, you'll have an older unit and a newer unit. And we'll have the radar specialists on board and the navigation consultant people's on board to record everything and see if changing the gain or different settings will help to eliminate some of the problems. So this is mostly just to look at seeing if the newer units might be better at handling wind turbine interference than the older ones. Did you have a question, Mike, or should I go on?
Nope, that's perfect. We've got some radar members, so I'm sure they'll be really interested in hearing about that. So thanks for sharing that, and you can go to the next slide.
Okay. And then, so the mitigation is a big issue. Everyone's very concerned about sort of the unknowns of how this is going to impact the fishing industry. And so there are some mitigation plans that have been approved. They're approved through the states, through the Coastal Zone Management Act and Federal Consistency Review. So right now for the Vineyard Wind 1 project, there are 2 mitigation plans that have been approved, one in Rhode Island and one in Massachusetts. And they have some minor differences, but basically there are two funds set up. One is a direct compensation fund, which is if your revenue is hurting either through the construction phase or the operation phase, and you fish in that area, you can make a claim and get direct compensation. The second fund is more for different ways that these funds can be used to help keep the fishing industry whole during these changes. So some of those funds could be used for upgrading safety equipment, whether it's getting AIS where you didn't have it, or a newer radar unit, or as an example, you have stated in your position statement, an artificial reef program. So there's different avenues for supporting the fishing industry in different ways through that second set of fund that isn't as precise as lost revenue. So these plans have been accepted. There's still, I'm sure there's still going to be different suggestions or ways to improve it, but right now there is some mitigation plans out there to, again, to try to support the fishing industry for some of the unknowns that are out there with this new industry.
So Krista, if I'm hearing you right, that's funds that the developers are putting up for mitigation, but they're managed by the state, is that right?
So both in Rhode Island, the second set of funds, they're called different things in the states, innovation funds or fisheries support funds. Those are managed, the Rhode Island one is managed through a fishery advisory board. The Massachusetts one is managed through the state. So, but they're technically, yes, they are, the thread is through the state. The direct compensation funds is going to be a third party. So it won't be the developers, it won't be the state. That money will be held by a third party, and There'll be criteria set up to make a claim. Once the criteria is met, then the claim will be paid out. And just one other note, there's no incentive for the developers not to want to pay claims, because all that money, if it's not used for direct compensation, will go into the second fund that supports the fishing industry in different ways. So we're actually right now in the process of setting up the criteria for the claims, and we will be reaching out to the fishing industry to help with that process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, gathering input from the industry will help you guys develop a good
Right.
criteria there. And
then really my last slide is just to kind of ask for help from the fishing industry. How do we better communicate? What we can do to make sure this two-way communication is happening. So some things we've implemented so far is we've started monthly port hours where actually the developers from the different lease areas in the Mass Rhode Island area come together, and we send out an announcement about a certain time that we'll all be together on the docks in New Bedford, or in Stonington, Connecticut, or in Point Judith, Rhode Island. So that's one way we try to reach out to the industry. Recreational fishing shows, we try to have a presence there. That's how I met Mike in the first place. We've given presentations at different recreational group meetings that they have, either monthly or annually. If we are invited to come speak, we will. We've distributed information at bait shops, hoping some of that information can reach the recreational fleet. And we've reached out to, again, organizers of fishing tournaments or derbies to make sure we have that open communication and to see if they want some information to share with during the derbies and tournaments. So if there's any feedback on how we can improve the outreach, I'd be happy to hear it. So, and with that's the end of the presentation. My name again is Krista Bank. We do have another fishery liaison that's come on recently. Her name's Kayla Howard. I should have added her information here. So yeah, we're working to make sure we can make the best out of this situation with a lot of unknowns. So thank you again for your time. Any last questions, Mike?
Yeah, no, thank
you.
Oh, that's okay. At the very end. No, Krista, thank you so much for coming on and talking with all of us, or talking with me and presenting to our industry about the complications and the challenges and the opportunities for offshore wind and fisheries to coexist. We know that, as you saw from the early map, there's a lot of different lease areas across a broad geographic range here. And so although there aren't a lot of turbines in the water right now, there will be in the future. And so developing a relationship with you is important for our industry, and making sure we're engaged and providing you the information that you need to develop these responsibly is right where we want to be. So thank you for spending the time with us. I put up my contact information as well. So feel free to contact me, and Krista had her contact information, and we'll make sure that that information is also part of the seminar series website for ICAST 2020 online. So thank you, Krista, and to the Vineyard Wind team, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
All right, thank you very much.